Good day, folks. Everything new under the sun. An update as it relates to Kherson. Now, we've been following this where the Russians have pulled back to the south of the river there, and the dam is up in Zaporizhia where that red mark is there. That's the dam that they suggested, both sides suggested the other side was going to blow it up in a false flag attempt or something. Now the Russians have pulled back to the south side. They're calling it the left side of the river. They pulled out of Kherson. Ukrainian forces have, of course, went into Kherson, and it was, to big shouts and hurrahs that the Russians are losing and pulling back and getting out of Ukrainian territory more and more. But here is the interesting thing. News now is coming out that maybe there's going to be an EMP, and this is what we were wondering. Was it going to be the blowing up of the dam or a tactical nuclear weapon? The suggestion is that an EMP is going to be used, and this would absolutely, it's really the kind of the easiest ways that Russia can battle Ukrainian forces without overtly calling NATO onto the scene. If they use a nuclear weapon and there's nuclear fallout, NATO would hop in. If let me show this here. If they use a nuke on the ground for ground destruction, well, again, NATO, I think, would come in at that point. But if they simply explode a nuclear device in the air for purposes of an electromagnetic pulse, which would take out all communications, any vehicle with a chip in it, power systems, all that would go down. If they simply did that, and that would take out all cell phone towers, really all forms of communication, and even Elon Musk's Starlink transmitters, that would take those out of the picture, and then Russia would be able to roll right over Ukraine because they wouldn't have any command and control. Well, so here's the news coming out. This is War News 247. The time is running backwards for EMP use. Again, the translation is a bit odd because this is a Greek website translated by Google Translate. We will use weapons of mass destruction in due time. Evacuation of Kakhovka. So this is very interesting. Interesting developments. This story is today, November 12th. For the first time, a top Russian official talks about certain use of weapons of mass destruction and admits Russia will use them in due time. Medvedev's statements come after hysteria in British and American circles about the imminent use of a weapon that will cause an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, with incalculable consequences. And again, this is one of those things that I don't think NATO will go in for, as long as there's because EMP doesn't necessarily kill people right off the bat, but it destroys communications, destroys command and control, allows Russia to roll in with their military hardware and take over the place, and no one has any way to communicate with each other, right? Or their vehicles are disabled because of the EMP. Now, Russia, again, has evacuated all of its forces down to the south side of the Dnieper River, I guess, the Dnieper, whatever you want to call it, river. And Kherson is all evacuated in terms of Russian forces, and very, very interesting. And people thought, well, maybe they're going to blow up the dam and all the water's going to rush down. Well, it may be more nefarious and an interesting twist that I hadn't seen. An EMP is a very interesting option there. In two developments of importance, Moscow proceeded. The Russians designated as the temporary administration capital of Kherson, Ganachevsk, far from the front, and the Russian commander of Kakhovka on the left bank or south side of the Dnieper announced that the city was being evacuated by civilians, who they must leave immediately for Tuapsy, Russia. We were informed today, November 12th, we have to leave with our families, says a citizen. Therefore, says the translation, something unpleasant is coming to Ukraine, either blowing up the dam or using an electromagnetic weapon. And again, I think Russia has calculated that NATO's not likely to come in if all they do is an EMP and it doesn't destroy a lot of life, and there's not a lot of fallout, nuclear radioactive fallout from this. If it's a simple EMP, and Russia can use that to their advantage and take over more of Ukraine by shutting down vehicles, shutting down communications, and shutting down the smart, quote unquote smart weapons, then that's a perfect opportunity and hole in the wall for Russia to exploit. Security Council Vice President Medvedev also urges Russian people to remember the achievements, but also the difficult task of the military, and a reminder that only unity can bring much desired victory in Ukraine. Speaking of difficult military decisions in Kherson, the former president of Russia typically states that Russia, for obvious reasons to all reasonable people, has not yet used its arsenal of potential means of mass destruction, i.e., the nuclear weapons, and it did not hit any potential enemy targets located in settlements. And not just because of our inherent human goodness, everything has its time, and that is an interesting statement. Everything has its time. They haven't hit civilian targets in earnest yet. They have hit some, but not yet. They've been going after power stations, critical infrastructure, but everything has its time. And again, Medvedev apparently is suggesting that there could be the use of nuclear weapons. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's interesting. So I think I'll leave it there. You guys can go to War News 247 .gr, I guess it is, and just Google War News 247, and you'll find this article. And I think it's very interesting. We will use weapons of mass destruction in due time. Consider if an EMP were to go off. Would that draw NATO in? Would that draw out the Article 5 of the the Constitution or the Agreement of NATO or something like that? Well, I guess it wouldn't draw that out. But would NATO get involved? Of course, Ukraine isn't a NATO country. But the problem is, if it affects a neighboring NATO country in any way, fallout, whatever it may be, or EMP for that matter, if the EMP scope of this hits a NATO nation, does that trigger Article 5? Or, is that enough? If it's completely contained in Ukraine, is that enough for NATO to escalate things? And I think Russia is likely calculating that, that could be the best, the easiest way, the least, really the easiest way, without the use of a whole bunch of manpower, without the use loss of a whole bunch of human life, which would certainly bring NATO in the world against Russia even more, and even Russian citizens. And EMP is kind of one of the cleanest, easiest ways to disable an army. And is that why Russia's pulling back all its troops to get them out of there, so that their communications aren't destroyed, so that their tanks with computer chips on them aren't wrecked by a potential EMP blast, and so that as soon as everything goes dark in Kherson, in all the areas around it, maybe even Ukraine, then they can roll in with all their artillery, with all their communications, and occupy Kherson, if not larger parts of the country. So this is very interesting news coming out today. War News 247, folks. Be prepared. This is why you need a Faraday cage. If you don't know what a Faraday cage is, go Google it. A Faraday cage is something you put electronics in, so that if an EMP does go off, or a coronal mass ejection from the sun, it keeps those electronics safe. It prevents them from getting destroyed. Now, you can put your cell phone in there, and your cell phone might work, but cell towers might be down because they're not going to be protected by a Faraday cage. However, what you can do is, if you have FRS, Family Radio Service radios, put a couple of those in, so you can hand one to your neighbor after an EMP or after a coronal mass ejection, after some grid down event, so you can communicate. Communication is one of the biggest keys to your survival. Ham radio. Stick a ham radio in a big metal garbage can, for example. I have garbage can cellars, and so you can stick a couple ham radios in there. Remember, they don't need necessarily a repeater. They don't need a tower for you to communicate to other people in the community. If someone else has a ham radio, you can communicate, upwards even 50 kilometers, 60 kilometers, depends how high you are. A lot of it's line of sight. And that will help you get news as to what's going on. That will help you communicate for security purposes, to relay information back and forth in a complete grid down, communication down, internet down situation. And what happened after Fiona in the Maritimes? All communications were down. Even cell towers were having huge, massive issues. Even texts weren't going through. Certainly calls were not going through. And what was left over? Well, it was the amateur radio guys that were able to communicate when all that was having trouble. And we could communicate quite well. So these are the things you need to get prepared for. And an EMP, well, pretty low chance that it would happen in North America. If for whatever reason we would go to World War III, then the likelihood of that is very, very possible. Because again, it's going to be a lot easier to do an EMP burst and take out North America. You don't have to kill anybody. You just have to shut down all our communications, and our civilization in North America, in the West, would be an absolute chaos at that point in time. Mad Max situation. It would be absolute Mad Max if an EMP or a coronal mass ejection took out all communications, the grid, and if that stuff was down for multiple days, weeks in duration. So be prepared, folks. I hope you know the Lord Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. He's coming soon, but before that are some tough times. I think we're going to head through the four horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation chapter 6 before the wrath of God comes. That means we're going to be here to be witnesses for the Lord during that time, and it's going to be hard. So you need to be prepared, folks. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.